Welcome to the 5th episode of Yɛresiesie Yɛn, the Preparation for Reparations podcast, discussing whose justice, interrogating power in global reparations movements. I'm your host, Esther Xosei, and today I'm excited to introduce a new voice to our conversation.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone. I'm Simeon and I'm honoured to join Auntie Esther as co-host on this important platform. I've been following developments of the podcast since its inception and I'm looking forward to contributing to these vital discussions on reparations.
We're delighted to hear from you, Simeon. In our previous episodes, particularly the last episode, episode 4, which was a part 1 and 2, we explored protection strategies for reparations movements, examining how to guard against movement capture and counterinsurgency tactics. Today, we'll be building on that critical foundation by interrogating several recent developments in the global reparations landscape.
Excellent. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, Yɛresiesie Yɛn is a powerful phrase from our Akan ancestors, meaning we are preparing ourselves. This reminds us that reparations isn't something passively received. In fact, it's something we actively create through preparation and collective strengthening.
Absolutely. But before we get into this discussion further, let's pour some libation. We pour libation to the Creator of the heavens and the earth, source of all wisdom and discernment, to our Mother Earth who sustains our life struggles, to the ancestors and ancestresses who faced and overcame attempts to silence their resistance against the Ma'angamizi, whose vigilance helps protect our movements today, whose clarity guides our vision, whose wisdom helps us distinguish allies from adversaries. May our words honor their sacrifices, and may our works advance our struggle. Ashe, Ashe, Ashe-yo.
Today, we'll be examining several significant developments: the honouring of women in the reparations movement, the contradictions of the Ghana Summit with its focus on healing, tensions revealed in the process of organising the London Dialogue on Pan-Afrikanism, developments in the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, and the African Union's theme on justice for Africa and Africans through reparations. Rather than simply reporting on these events, we'll be unpacking contradictions and tensions within them, asking who is truly served by the initiatives and how do they relate to our discussions of movement protection and capture. Now, sliding on to women's recognition within reparations movements. In our overview of recent discussions and developments, you mentioned being recognized for your reparations work. Can you share more details on this, Anna?
Yes. In December, I received word from Chief Imam Mahawasese Drame, Chair of the Global African Women's Day and President of the Drame Institute, that I'd been selected as a recipient of the 2025 Global African Woman of Distinction Award, acknowledging and celebrating my quote-unquote unwavering commitment to reparatory justice and the profound impact on advancing human rights. So I went in person to pick up my award, and the award ceremony took place on the 16th of March in International Women's Month. And that date, the 16th of March, has been declared Global African Women's Day. And this award ceremony and gala took place in Harlem.
Wow. So I was just looking over the notes and it said that it was at the Alhambra Ballroom. So a very significant recognition in a significant venue. But I've got to ask you, besides yourself, who else was honoured?
Yeah, important to say I wasn't the only one honoured. The other honorees included Paula Yanez Hino Fuentes from Bolivia, who coordinates the network of Afro-Latin American, Afro-Caribbean and diaspora women. Photographer Marilyn Nance, who documented Festac 77. Dr. Aisha Mohammed Oyobode, who leads the Mutala Muhammad Foundation, and Vice President of Colombia, Honorable Francia Marquez Mina. And finally, there was a legacy award awarded to Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma.
Wow, super interesting. And congratulations to each and every one of you on these accolades. But I've got to ask again, with that recognition, during the significant moment with 2025 being declared the year of reparations from the African Union, what else do you have to say?
Well, you know what? I think, yes, I received an honour, but I don't see it as being about me. I think it was a recognition of the work that I've been doing in community, and significantly to be recognized when there are so many attempts to deny the significance of the activism that I am involved with collectively. So that's how I saw it. You know, I saw it as a really significant achievement because, you see, when you're doing this type of work, it's a thankless task. I've heard so many people say that, and it's true. But sometimes it's really heartwarming to know that people recognize, appreciate, value the work that you're doing and that they see you. And that's important because part of what I've also experienced is a lot of attempts to marginalize me, sideline me, pretend that I don't exist or that I haven't been making kind of important contributions to advocating for reparations or reparatory justice for our people. And with the kind of increasing movement capture, elite capture and state capture around reparations, there is like a usurping of the hard work that gets done. And there isn't a recognition of the sacrifices that some of us make. And somebody like myself, this is my work. I don't have a job somewhere and do this as a hobby. This is a lifetime struggle. And 99.9% of it is not resourced in any way, shape or form. And it has meant to stay focused on this agenda, I've had to give up a lot. And that doesn't always get recognized, especially when people are critical of what I'm doing. Because I am a kind of public figure in that I am out there, I do lots of advocacy, I do media, so it's not me alone, but I am a representative of many others, many other constituencies that I support and amplify their voices. And so it was, I think, significant and important to just recognize that this work matters, that people are listening, that people are supporting this work, and that people feel that it has value. And that is particularly, I think, important in a time when the corporate media focuses on elites, they focus on governments, they focus on university professors and academics with all these accolades, establishment accolades, that I don't have, for instance, and choose not to have. But yet, the perspectives that I think I advocate and represent have come from the knowledge production that happens in social movements when we struggle, when we resist oppression, when we resist the legacies of the Maangamizi, and we create alternative paradigms and frameworks for, and visions, in fact, of repair.
Okay, and I'll just ask if you could sum this up very quickly. Why is it that this comprehensive approach that you've elaborated is very much needed in today's world?
So it's needed because there's a lot of deep thought that goes into reparations. The articulation of what we want, what reparations mean to us, why reparations are something that we have to effect and secure. And the award gave me space and a platform to also acknowledge the long line of reparations foremothers that not only have influenced me, but who have been part of shaping the international social movement for African reparations and other global African reparations movement from their inception, which was the beginning of when we were kidnapped and trafficked on the continent of Africa. And so the award was particularly honouring women. And that was significant to me because so many of those that get promoted are men. And even when we say things as women, they are often not heard unless a man is saying it. Or it is assumed that a man has created it and thought up all the solutions or all the ideas, when that is not necessarily true. So yeah, that's what I would say. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, Simeon, but I think also because the award was framed in a way as kind of acknowledging the African Union's theme on justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. And it comes, if you like, at the beginning of the United Nations declared second international decade for people of African descent. It did kind of give, I think, global, certainly international recognition from amongst women and men, but in particular peers. There's nothing, I think, more significant than recognition by one's peers. That even though some of the women that I was honoured with or some of the women that were there might, move in different circles to me, the recognition of myself as a grassroots, community-based, community-engaged scholar activist who is doing work that has helped to influence reparation strategies and tactics and movement building worldwide. And so it was beautiful to receive, and it was a beautiful award ceremony and gala. And I think, given some of the mentors that I've had, there isn't a lot of space or time in our movements. And I've heard different views around this, like whether we should be recognizing individuals or not. And you often hear, it's about the collective struggle, which is true. But it's also the case that you often have people who act in a vanguard way, who are positioned or sometimes are able to voice or amplify perspectives that others are not able to, not because they're being silenced, but they might not be in that position. And so it's also important to recognize that not everyone does this. Not everyone can do this. And it's not easy to do, because when you speak up and you speak out, you become a target. And not everyone wants to lose the jobs that I've lost, Not everyone wants to be economically disenfranchised. Not everyone wants to have their public reputation constantly scrutinized and to be constantly character assassinated. Not everyone chooses to go through that. For those of us that have chosen it, or that has been an outcome of the activism that we have chosen, I think it's important to find ways to encourage us so that we stay committed, so that we know that we're on the right track, and we know that our people are seeing what we're doing and that they are with us.
Okay, that was a fantastic answer there. And just circling back again on the point of this being the year of reparations via the African Union.
So it has been declared by the African Union, but what does that mean? We have to kind of give meaning to that for ourselves. And for me, I think it's analysing this year and anything that is happening under the auspices of this year through our own critical framework of movement protection.
How so?
So what's particularly meaningful for me is that this award recognised my role coordinating the Stop the Mangamizi, We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign, and also advocating for the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice. So it's encouraging to see these fundamental aspects of our own campaigning work, beginning in PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, and extending to campaigns like the Stop the Mangamizi campaign, being acknowledged also in these international spaces.
Okay, and just elaborate on that in terms of the importance of community building power.
Yes, it highlights the importance of building community power as the foundation of our work. Power, and I would say accountability. Mm-hmm. So while recognition is appreciated, and I think I've demonstrated that, the true measure of our effectiveness remains in how we strengthen our grassroots movements and advance substantive repair that transforms systems rather than simply reforming them.
Okay, and that allows us to move on to Ghana Summit 2, problematizing the focus on healing. Now, the Accra Summit 2 was recently held from March the 26th through to the 28th in Ghana. Its theme was centering healing for Africans and global African diasporans in the context of the African Union theme of this year, 2025, on reparations. This builds on Ghana's leadership in the diaspora relations since the Year of Return initiative. But I'm more curious to know about your critical response on this summit, Auntie Esther.
So sure, the Accra Summit 2 was co-convened by the Global Circle for Reparations and Healing, the African Union, and Justice and Repair. It brought together participants, I think around 60 of us, from across Africa, the Caribbean, North America, South America, Abya as we would say, and Europe, at a warm and beautiful resort in Ghana. So I was one of 4 people that attended the Accra Summit 2 from the UK. Although interestingly, I was the only one of the 4 people that attended from the UK who was not on the official programme. A small but telling example of how certain voices and perspectives might be marginalised even within spaces dedicated to our liberation and healing. I found that really interesting. Not that I had to be on a program, but it was really unusual for me to be in a reparations summit or conference or gathering coming from the UK, where I am, recognized as being a leading voice on reparations in the UK. And those that were on the program, I don't think are recognized in the same way as I am in terms of movement building around reparations. So that was really interesting for me to actually be quiet. I mean, it was different. It was good. It meant that I was able to listen very attentively, but it's just a strange position to be in when you're so used to being an advocate and called on to contribute to processes like this, especially something so significant being held on the African continent and in Ghana, where there is so much attention, especially given some of those kind of state representatives that were there. It was just curious to me which voices were being heard and which voices were not, because my voice is not an individual voice. I have to keep stressing that. I often represent many voices that are just not even factored in, whether we're talking about African indigenous communities on the continent and across the diaspora, or those of us in the diaspora who have maintained, our African indigeneity and continued this struggle, amidst great repression. So I always see myself, and many people who know me will know that I am part of so many different organizations and formations and have always kind of played this role. So yes, when certain voices are absent, then it also means that the perspectives of millions of our people are also absent.
Well, I suppose in some circles that speaks volumes. In others, it probably raises questions about who actually gets officially recognized within these spaces. Now, why do you think that you were invited but not included on the program, especially reflecting back on your recent recognition with the Global African Women of Distinction Award for your activism?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And as a humble person, it's difficult to answer, because I want to stress, some people listening to this may get the wrong end of the stick. It's not really about me being included on the program, but it was interesting to note that other people who went from the UK were on the program. And I kind of felt very, silent in the process. And it's not that I couldn't speak, it's just that the nature of how the program was set up meant that I didn't feel it necessary. It's like how you set up your space. If you're an organizer, it's also about whether you set up your event in a way that people feel they can speak, right? And then the nature of how it was very focused on this sort of, like healing, but for me in a kind of somewhat, I don't want to come across, I don't know how I'm coming across, but in a sort of artificial way. So sometimes you can set up healing spaces that they're so safe that if you say anything that doesn't quite fit that framing, you yourself might be considered to be somebody who is exhibiting unhealed behavior. So there was a lot of talk about healed and unhealed behavior. And oftentimes I felt like saying things, but it also felt like I would have come across negative, because it was all on, we're so healed, it's like we're so chilled and everyone's happy and we all get along and there's no tension. And so for me to introduce something that went contrary to that framing, I think it wouldn't have necessarily been received well. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question about why I think I was invited. I've been asked this by several movement colleagues, especially in the Stop the Manganese campaign. They're like, why were you invited to go there? What was your purpose in being there besides having a trip paid for to go to Ghana and staying in a luxury resort? What were you really doing there? And I had to really dig deep in actually trying to honestly answer this question. And I don't think I could answer it. But interestingly enough, one of the co-organizers, who I don't necessarily need to name, but I remember him saying at one of the, sort of activities that there were at the end, at the kind of closing sort of ceremony, he made a point about saying how everybody that had been invited had played a significant role just by our very presence being there, and that, not everyone was kind of on the program. And I thought it was interesting what he was saying, and I did wonder whether I'm not saying he was speaking to me, but it was an interesting thing to say. And he sort of said something like, when it came to choosing some of the people on the program, they relied on, I guess, people who were advising them. And again, that was an interesting thing to hear. We had a brother, Onyekechi Wambo, who is one of the leaders of AFFORD, the African Foundation for Development, and who shares the running of the Secretariat for the All-Party Parliamentary Group for African Reparations. We had Sister Ra-Marie Mukam, who I've known for a long time, an African-centered psychotherapist who runs the Patty Gift Centre in Birmingham. And we had our brother, who is assistant professor of African and Atlantic history, Xosei Lingna Nafafe, who actually gave a very dynamic presentation that I'll probably talk a little bit more about later on in the show. But they were the other contributors, and they were all on the program. And in fact, Brother Onyekechi not only was a speaker on the program, he also facilitated one of the panel discussions. So he was on the program twice. So those were the people. I can remember Sister Ra-Marie McCam saying to me in a jokey way, how comes like you're not doing any work, sort of thing, in terms of, just the fact that those who were on the program would have obviously had to prepare presentations as part of the contribution.
Well, I've got to ask, was this a pacification exercise? Were they trying to numb you down and numb minds like yours down? Because I've been made to understand from some circles that the participants were funded to attend, and that the funding was provided by organizers such as the Wellspring Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation. Now, in light of that, how should we analyze the role of these philanthropic institutions and their endeavors within the reparations space?
And you do raise important questions about who was invited, because I was asking other people I knew in the movement, are you going to be in Ghana at the Accra Summit? And they were like, no. So clearly some of us were chosen, some of us were on the, if you like, the guest list to attend. I was one of those people. I did not pay for my travel. I did not pay for the accommodation. I wouldn't have been able, to be quite honest, I wouldn't have been able to afford it where we were staying. But I still come back to that fundamental question. Was I invited primarily for optics? Interestingly enough, some of the Instagram posts that I saw, I do appear in them, with my characteristic smile, and it looked like we're having a great time on the beach. And, some parts of it were quite opulent and all of that. I've never stayed in an all-inclusive hotel, but it was literally all you could eat for breakfast, lunch and dinner. We didn't have to go anywhere, and I think that was by design, because they wanted people to focus on the discussions that we were having. But I'm unclear. It was really unclear to me, why was I there? Because there was a lot of social workers, psychotherapists, psychologists. It was actually co-chaired by Dr. Joy DeGuy, who many people will know, and it was a lot of people in the quote-unquote healing profession, so-called. And I found that characterization even interesting, because when I think about myself as a jurisconsult and the tradition of law that I practice, it is very much about using law as a healing balm and remedy, law as resistance. And also in my own advocacy career, I have emphasized the importance of law in being able to heal and resolve conflicts and tensions between people. So this characterization of healers as being these specific types of professionals made me just think and reflect, which we never really got to grapple with in the summit. What is healing? Who is a healer? Because it just felt like we were creating another sort of elevation of particular types of professionals. And it made me remember the comments of one of my own mentors, ancestress, Queen Mother Dorothy Benton Lewis, who co-founded INCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. And I've gone on to follow in her footsteps as well by being involved in INCOBRA and being a co-chair of the International Affairs Commission. But I remember Queen Mother Dorothy saying to me years ago on one of my many trips to America, Esther, it seems like I'm going to have to become a lawyer to stay relevant in my own movement. And she was speaking to an era that when I joined reparations, that a lot of the people that were seen as being the leaders and people were listening to was the lawyers. But like the hotshot lawyers, African-American lawyers, the Professor Charles Ogletrees, the Johnny Cochran's, it was this idea that it was going to be these hotshot lawyers that were going to go and win us our reparations. And people like Queen Mother Dorothy, who had been actively organizing, 40, 50 years, feeling that somehow her work, her labor, her toil, her leadership, her exemplary leadership role was not being recognized because she did not have legal qualifications. And I'm just wondering, is this another dimension of that where it's now about the healers? Because they were focusing on rehabilitation, which we know is a component of reparations under international law. And they were emphasizing, look, rehabilitation is not something that we need anyone else to do. This is what we can do and must do for ourselves. But it promoted a model of healing that some find extremely problematic. This idea that we're just, unhealed and we just need to have therapy or have these, healing professionals come and help address whatever's going wrong, but without actually challenging the material dimensions of oppression that actually make it difficult to truly heal ourselves.
And could you very briefly sum up what you think would be the benefits of having relationships with such individuals within the movement, and what may be some of the downsides as well?
So the benefits are that we do need to recognize the psychological, spiritual, cultural dimensions of the Maangamizi and how it continues to impact us as a people. And when we have people that have been trained, that are professionals, this is their skills base, they have something very worthwhile to add to our movements. They have something very worthwhile to add, and perhaps haven't been given enough credit and recognition, because they are helping to deal with some of the behavioral dimensions, the patterns that we repeat, that actually prevents us from unifying, prevents us from actually overcoming some of the intergenerational trauma that we experience and so forth. So those for me are some of the benefits of having this focus on healing. But as I said, without having a deeper reflection on what does healing mean, who is a healer, and how can we heal, just by kind of being isolated in a nice space, for a few days or a retreat, but yet we go back into the real world, into our material circumstances, where people are forced to engage in quote unquote unhealed behavior for survival. And I don't think those dimensions of healing were sufficiently explored, because the program was really packed and it just didn't come out at all. The other bit of it to me goes back to your earlier question around the role of philanthropic organizations like the Wellspring Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation, and their role in resourcing particular types of reparations work. And it did, and there were some interesting, side conversations that were had with actually a member of the MacArthur Foundation, who shared that within these types of organizations, they are only willing to support or resource particular types of reparations work or activism. So they're not particularly interested in supporting movements or formations that are promoting self-determination and autonomy, for instance, or land reclamation. But they will fund what I think is seen as soft touch healing, because oftentimes the healing narrative is still happening as though we just need to heal. It doesn't really, and certainly I didn't hear talk about that in the conference. I'm not saying the people who were leading it didn't have this in their mind, but it wasn't expressed. That how do we heal outside of liberation struggle, How do we do that? So it does raise, I think, questions around what criteria, and the fact that we need to have clear criteria for assessing whether these philanthropic institutions are genuinely supporting movement building and the autonomy of reparations movements, or are they engaged in movement capture, subtly reshaping agendas to align with their own interests. So we need criteria to be able to work out who is who and what is what, and whether something is ultimately going to be in our own interests, or is it going to create a new tier of the gurus who themselves, because they are professionals, there's a whole are we going to see a new healing reparations industrial complex in the way that we've got an academic industrial complex around reparations, for instance?
Oh, okay. But then what about their relationship to the movement's leadership?
crucial question to ask. And we must ask, do they genuinely fund grassroots leaders or primarily established professional activists or organisers or simply professionals? How do they relate to autonomous movements operating outside institutional frameworks? Are they funding diverse voices or reinforcing existing cliques and power centres within our movements? And believe it or not, it is often felt that there are cliques emerging around reparations in terms of who funders or philanthropic organisations, let me say, are resourcing.
Okay. So I guess what you're saying there actually speaks to who shapes the global reparations agenda.
Exactly. Who is really identifying and choosing so-called leaders in these so-called global initiatives? What selection processes determine who gets invited? I don't know why I was invited, resource to go in terms of having my flight paid for and accommodation paid for. Who is also getting platformed? We need to interrogate whether these foundations are exporting also US-centered models to Africa and the rest of the world, including Europe, rather than respecting cognitive justice and epistemological diversity, in that where we struggle also creates its own kind of knowledge, and that as African people, our experiences of the Maangamizi may be similar but are also different.
So are you saying that there are many contradictions within healing-focused initiatives and programs?
Absolutely. How can we take seriously healing frameworks promoted by those who demonstrate unhealed behaviour within our own organising spaces? So we need to be the change. We need to be the reparatory justice change that we seek. And there are visible rifts and conflicts within movements here, there, and everywhere that are simultaneously promoting healing to others. Most fundamentally, how can we talk about healing without ancestral recognition, proper divination practices, and lineage restoration work that reconnects us to our source? I'm saying that because in many sort of African-centered spaces that I am accustomed to, we often acknowledge ancestors. We pour libation. There'll be some type of spiritual grounding. And I noticed that at the Accra Summit too, libation didn't occur until halfway through day one. And it was actually introduced by one of the guests on the program, a Ghanaian brother, scholar activist brother who's an artist. And so I was making comments about this because I'm thinking, we're in Ghana. Where is the kind of grounding with our ancestors, especially talking about the need for healing?
So are you saying that simple yes, no assessments can't work within this type of space?
What do you mean, simple yes, no assessments?
Or does it go beyond them? Or is it simply a case of being able to say, I agree or I don't agree?
Well, I think no, simple yes, no assessments are not sufficient. We need multi-dimensional analysis that examines whether foundations, for instance, and philanthropic organisations support movements calling for fundamental transformation of the world, including economic systems, or are only those working within established capitalistic frameworks. I mean, do they support, if you like, the industries that are developing now around healing and repair? Do they fund self-determination movements or primarily NGOs, community development initiatives? Do they support strategies such as non-territorial autonomy that, for instance, some of us are advocating in the UK, particularly in the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, the Global African People's Parliament and others? Or do they only support initiatives that operate within existing political boundaries and that encourage us to be lobbying elected officials and just sticking within the system as it is? So without going into specifics about any particular foundation, which I'd love to do a show with you, Brother Simeon, on another time, I just want to note that when foundations primarily fund initiatives convened in comfortable spaces, I mean, we all like luxury. I'm sure we all like comfort. But I couldn't help but feeling like a sense of guilt because many of the communities that I'm working with in Ghana didn't even know about this summit, were not able to attend. And it wanted to attend and was sort of saying, well, who's involving us? How comes we're not being recognized too? And I felt uncomfortable with that I was able to go there, but yet they couldn't.
So I guess this connects and alludes to a point that you raised earlier about these settings and environments.
Yeah, because how do we just promote, important as they are, discourses around healing that are disconnected from material redistribution? So we must question whose interests are truly being served. So I'm saying this because 5-10 minutes walk outside the hotel, you see a lot of the underdevelopment in Ghana. You get onto the highways, you see the polluted atmosphere, you see the child beggars, you see predominantly young people, and I'd say specifically young girls and women. They call them hawkers, who are carrying goods on their heads and they're selling. They have to do this for survival, and we're kind of being fed up. And, when I say fed up, I mean fed well. in a very nice resort. And I kept thinking about those people. What does all this healing stuff mean to them?
So that raises for me a very crucial question, just shedding light on what you closed your last point on. And that is, who actually does have access to these healing spaces and who is excluded from them?
Precisely. So while it should be recognised that the event featured the presence of different types of people, including African Union representatives from the government of Ghana, artists, elders, leaders in philanthropy, civil society, representatives from African think tanks, we must also ask whose healing was being prioritized in these spaces. When healing discussions happen in spaces that most Ghanaians, and I'd say Africans, could never access, we reproduce the very hierarchies that we claim to be addressing. And is it fair? Is it just? Is it reparatory that we can only provide that sort of approach to healing that only a few will ever be able to benefit from? And in fact, some of these questions were being posed by contributors at the summit who were questioning the professionals with the qualifications after their name and what it means to people who are living in villages in Ghana, who may not speak English as their first language, they're speaking their indigenous language. What does this type of healing, how is it relevant? How does it make a difference? How does it even impact the lives on, as I said, the majority of ordinary people in Ghana, which is where we were located?